Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Tsf Films Podcast. Today, my guest is Frank Boring. He is our advisor and executive producer for Tsf Films. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you very much.
So tell me a little bit about what got you into documentary film.
Sure. In a galaxy far away, my intention at a college was to become a playwright, to write for the theater. And I moved from upstate New York, which is where I had gone to college, to San Diego. And the theater that I started there allowed me to write my own work, get people. In other words, I produced live theater of my own plays. And you may or may not recall there was an incident called the Tiananmen Square Massacre in China when the students and people were hoping for democracy. And I watched that in horror as things going on. As a result of that, I got a chance to meet a number of Chinese Americans, academics, dentists, restaurant owners, and whatnot. And I wrote a play for it, which was shown at UCSD, University of California, San Diego. At that moment, I had kind of reacquainted myself with where I was born, which was in Taipei, Taiwan, the Republic of China. And I had an opportunity to meet some people that had been during that period of time, during the Chinese Civil War and afterwards. And one of the people that I met was a flying tiger, one of the original flying tigers. And he was a pilot during that period of time. What you may not know in history is that Pearl Harbor was not the beginning of World War II, the invasion of China. And these group of American volunteers went over there and basically stopped the bombing of Chinese cities. And I was fascinated by that. And I thought, I'd love to write a play about this. And not the guns and the fighting and all that, but maybe in the barracks or something. And a turning point in my life happened when I met with him and I said, I'd like to learn more about that period of time. And I said, what books should I read? And he said, well, there's not a whole lot of books that are accurate. There's a lot of books, but we don't really like them. And I said, well, how about a documentary? And he said, there is no documentary. There's a movie with John Wayne, which really is not accurate, but there is no documentary. And then, naive as I was, I'm looking at this ex-fighter pilot who's now in his 80s but could have been killed in his 20s. And I said, well, somebody should do one. And how's that for a long-winded way of saying that's how I got involved in documentary filmmaking?
That's very interesting. And then you went to go on to produce The Flying Tigers. Could you tell me a little bit more about the success that your documentary had?
Sure. The thing that you may not know is it's not easy to get your programs onto any broadcaster, whether it's NBC, CBS, whatever. Of course, now the big one is Netflix and all that. What you needed to be able to have a program produced with PBS is to work with a PBS producer. I had no credits. I had producing credits for live theater, but I didn't have anything for television. I got really, really lucky because I contacted the head of the arts community in San Diego because they knew me as a playwright. And I pitched this idea. I said, it's a great idea about this group of Americans that went to China to try to save them, the Chinese cities. I have access to these people that were there. I speak Chinese. And she said, this is a great idea, great idea. And she gave me the name of the head of the PBS in San Diego. And so I called, and he was waiting for it. He knew because the introduction had been made. And I said, my name is Frank Boring. I was born in China. My father was involved in Chinese Civil War and World War II. I have this access to, and I told him I have pictures, I have home movie. He just got really excited. He said, yeah, that's exactly what PBS is looking for. And I said, great. He says, what have you produced on PBS? And I said, well, produced theater. He goes, no. If you want to produce something on PBS, you have to have produced something on PBS. And so I said, well, how do you do that? And he said, well, I'll give you a list of 5 producers in the area that have the credentials. And if you can convince them or one of them to work with you, then you're on your way. But it's a great project. And it turns out that the first name was named Frank Christopher. And I'm not kidding you. I said, well, my name is Frank. His name is Frank. I guess we got that much in common. Well, here's where luck comes in because I contacted him. He had just come back from Africa. He had done an Academy Award-nominated documentary on the war in El Salvador and almost got killed. So he'd done something in Central and South America. He had done a number of them across the United States. He'd never done anything in China. And so my offer was, I'll do the research. I have the access to these people. I speak Chinese. I'll make the arrangements. He hires the crew. He takes care of everything that I don't have any skills for. And so unlike most programs started by independent filmmakers, which go through a local PBS station, like we have Rocky Mountain PBS here, it's next to impossible to get something on nationwide. There are certain programs that are already on nationwide you can't touch. You know, the NewsHour, there's Mystery, there's a whole bunch of them like that. But in our case, when we finished the film, it was a co-production with Chinese Public Television, which we traveled to Taiwan, and I did the interviews there and negotiated, and also with New Zealand Public Television. So we had a really amazing program that nobody else had ever, was stuff that nobody's ever seen before. And so we submitted it to PBS, and we got lucky because they had a program called History's Best on PBS, and they would pick one independent film for each month of that year and feature it. And we were featured in the February of 2020.
So you actually got your film on nationwide
National
PBS.
television, which means it was shown on Rocky Mountain PBS. It was shown in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was shown in St. Louis. It was shown in New York. And it was an amazing experience. I was born in Taipei, Taiwan. I lived there for 18 years. To return there to do interviews with extraordinary people, I interviewed the actual Chinese Air Force. He was obviously still alive at the time. Chinese Air Force liaison to this group called the Flying Tigers. Had a wonderful experience with him, which I can tell you that story at another time, but it's a very funny story. At any rate, it was shown. One of the things that happened out of there is a good indication of how careful you have to be. We were in Los Angeles doing the final edit for the Chinese language version of the Flying Tigers. And Rita Gao, who was the Chinese producer from CTV, Chinese Public Television, that had come out and was staying in Santa Barbara with us, we sat down, and my partner, Frank Christopher, turned to me. We're in this big LA studio. He said, "This is it. You're the only two people that speak Chinese. So you have to listen to the narration in this Chinese language program, and you've got to let us know that it's ready to go," because they were waiting for it for broadcast, all over Asia. So we sat there, and Rita and I had seen this, I don't know how many times. I can't even count, 3, 4 times, all the way through, from beginning to end, listening very carefully to the Chinese narration. And we sat there, and we looked at it and opened. And the opening of the film is in 1941. The Jägersfontein, which Jägersfontein was a ship, carried this group across the seas. So the very first line of this program that's going to be shown on national television in the States and New Zealand television and in Chinese, the difference between 1941, what we heard was 1971.
Oh.
So in 1971, these people go off to, we were blown away. We'd missed it every single time.
Oh, and so that got put onto live television?
No. We caught it.
Oh, good.
So what he did was they went back to the edit and they found that same narrator saying 1941 at a different place, copy, paste, and we got saved. But can you imagine the humiliation of this?
Yes, that would have been a very big mistake. Well, I'm glad you were able to catch that.
Yeah.
Moving back onto your project with Tree Stump Films.
Sure.
What led you to want to create the program?
To give you some very brief background information, I had done a number of different documentaries after the Flying Tigers, PBS documentaries. And at some point had moved to Michigan to the Grand Valley State University and created the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, which is interviews with World War II vets that are now part of our American history. Did hundreds of those. And I have a very close friend who I've known since the 1980s, who is a donor here at CSU, and he was having a conversation with Tony Frank. And they were trying to decide what to do for the 150th anniversary, sesquicentennial coming up. And luckily for me, the suggestion was, well, I know a documentary filmmaker. I get flown out here. So in 2017, I began work on The Great Experiment, which is the CSU documentary of 150 years. But to get to your specific question, it was pretty obvious to me when I did the research before I came here and when I started working on the actual documentary, we didn't have a film program. We have film studies, we have a journalism program and whatnot, but nothing that specifically deals with the actual workings of the kind of work I was doing for a number of years as an independent filmmaker. How do you raise the money? How do you pitch the idea? How do you get a script together? All those things I learned from the ground up. I didn't go to film school. But I also worked with an Academy Award nominated documentary filmmaker, which is no easy feat to do. But at the same time, he was very generous with me. I learned a lot from him, and a lot since I apprenticed. So we finished the documentary in 2020 during the pandemic. And the idea was that I had met a number of students in those 3 years, and I'd met professors here too, that thought an idea of an actual documentary film program would be a good idea. The problem, of course, is that to start a class in any university, including CSU, is a long process. But Rocky Mountain Student Media, which I had met Pete Walk, the CEO, during the 3 years that I was working on the documentary. He and I became good friends. He and I talked. He comes from a film background. He recognized that there were students coming to CSU that were not necessarily going to be a journalism student. They were in Rocky Mountain Student Media. They were already doing photography. They were already doing video. But there was no real program that specifically targeted students that wanted to make documentary films. And so when my contract ran out for the documentary CSU 150 and went on to win an award and it was on PBS and all that kind of stuff, we then approached the university and said, look, I did this film. We have the support of Rocky Mountain Student Media. How do we make this happen? And so in November of 2020, what wasn't called Tree Stump Films, the documentary film program began at Rocky Mountain Student Media.
Very interesting. And where did the name Tree Stump Films come from?
It was in, I think, 2021. You have to realize, starting a brand new program that never existed before in CSU, in an organization that already had a history dating back to the 1800s with the Collegian and whatnot, November is not the best time to start a program.
Right.
Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's. So really you have to look at 2021. And so the idea was that we would build the basics of what it's going to take. So I had to write out a proposal. I had to put together the thing. How is this going to actually look? How is it going to work? Who are we going to try to attract and whatnot? And so really it was 21, 22 that things really started to get organized, so to speak. And since the students didn't really have any projects, I proposed several, one being the train, one being Chrisman. The Masons Hall was another one. And the idea was not so much that we were going to pursue my documentaries. The idea was that students would then come with their own ideas and whatnot. But at least we had something to work on. Something to work on. I didn't answer your question, did I?
You did not, no.
Okay. So you run that by me again, please?
How did the name Tree Stump
Oh, sorry. Yes. Okay. So now we're actually a documentary film program. And we actually have people in a room besides the first two that I started with that immediately graduated and went somewhere else. So I had a brand new group of people. What are we going to call ourselves? And there's probably, you could probably check with either Errol or with Pete Walk, but I think there was something like 20 some odd names. The Oval Films.
Interesting.
There's a bunch of them. Tree Stumps really kind of rose to the top because we knew that it had an inside joke for CSU, which was we have a tree stump that's been out there for God knows how long. And it's also the expression of free speech. You get up there and you have the right to be able to talk. And so that's where the original idea came from. Inside joke at CSU, but a universal theme as a film company, so that we're not just linked directly to the Oval or something like that.
Right. As the director of Tree Stump Films, we just created a new logo, and some people came to me asking if we could rename ourselves, but I actually also really love the name Tree Stump Films and everything it stands for, and I'm really happy to be a part of the title Tree Stump Films.
Well, I give you a lot of credit because you're the one that really looked at our logo, and which we just, believe me, we just threw it together. We were barely a documentary film program,
I
much
believe
less.
you.
Okay, yeah. So when you took the helm, or at least even before then, you were questioning about that. But I'm glad that the students still want to keep Tree Stump Films because I think that's a powerful image.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. And it's unique, but, kind of professional, but also kind of, I don't know, adds to the fact that we are a group of students.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it all kind of pulls together.
Yeah.
So I'm really happy with it.
Yeah.
Our final question is, what is your vision for Tree Stump Films in a perfect world where it can go any direction you'd like it to go?
Sure.
What would that look like?
The original idea was to create a program that will allow students that had an interest in this that did not necessarily adhere to their major or their particular skill sets while they're here. They were going to learn how to become documentary filmmakers, whether or not that went on further or not. And so what my hope was is that by creating this environment, it was going to be a program that would benefit them no matter what field they went into, whether it was IT or marketing or even film and video or whatever. And so the foundation of this required that we have some longevity to the people coming in, because the first semester we started this, I had one sophomore and one senior. I had one junior and one senior. So the senior immediately left in 2021. 2020, I then had one senior who was the one that started to train other people, and that's when Errol came in sometime after that. I'm not sure, may have been 2022. At any rate, 23. Where I see this going is to have an established program funded through the university as it is now and donors, and to be able to have grants as well. And the biggest step, which is going to actually, the first major step, is going to be on Friday when we have our meeting with the executive staff of Rocky Mountain PBS. Because prior to this time, they had made it clear what they wanted to have some kind of a formal relationship in which Rocky Mountain PBS and Rocky Mountain Student Media would interact. In other words, it would not just be we then send a bunch of films to them, they make comments back, they then approve it, then it goes on television. There's a path for internships. There's a path for potential employment, because my relationship when I had it in Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with the PBS station there, several of my students went on not only to become camera people, editors, but in two cases, two of them moved out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and ended up becoming producers on a PBS station outside of. So there's a track, so to speak. And so let's say, for example, that you're not interested in journalism. You're not going to become a journalist. You're not going to be newspaper, radio announcer, or whatever it happens to be.
Right,
but you
because, sorry, I would just like to add that we have over 7 majors that are a part of Tree Stump Films, which in comparison to other departments of Rocky Mountain Student Media, the other departments are definitely a majority of journalism majors. And we definitely have the most diverse amount of majors in our program.
But as you know, and you in particular, because you're really in a managerial position, okay, you're a producer, is that these students are going to learn how to speak better. They have to pitch ideas. They have to convince people to, because in the long run, I mean, picture me standing in front of a group of people and saying, I need to raise $400,000. How do you do that?
Right.
Okay. So these students they don't necessarily have to, within Tree Stump Films, learn how to raise that kind of money, but they'll learn the techniques of how you go about doing that. And whether or not you even use a camera or use an editing equipment or anything like that, the collaborative work with a team, which is very different than a classroom group project. Do you see where I'm going with this? Working as a team compared to a classroom group project. At least in my time in college, and certainly the students that I taught for the 10 years at the last university, when you say group project, what it means is 4 people are supposed to be doing it and 1 person does the work.
Right. Which is something that we definitely very much try to avoid here at Tree Stump Films.
And that's the training I'm talking about, though. So my long-term goal is to have students come through this program, regardless of their major, regardless of whether they become documentary filmmakers or not, with an experience that will help them in any place that they go to. Their confidence level will be stronger. Their teamwork their understanding of how to make a project go from the beginning to the end and actually have it on television, streaming. Well, I can do that with YouTube. Yeah.
Definitely not the same.
Not the same.
Not
Exactly.
at all.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Frank.
Thank
It's
you.
been a pleasure.
Carolina, thank you. I tend to talk too much, though, but
No, this was wonderful. Thank you.
good. Glad to hear it.